right, I will say this again, they have the right to use our name and likeness, and you're talking about trademarks. You use my trademark without my permission, otherwise, I'm going to take your house and your firstborn. Are you kidding me? So, radio uses billboards across the country's highways of America to promote the radio stations so that people will tune into their station because they are hearing our voice on their station so they can sell advertising. And more power to you. You should be making more money, become more successful, but the new artists are not going to get their fair shake. There are barely record companies left. The entire music industry is in disarray, and all these pennies are so important, especially for tomorrow's stars who are being born today. This is for our children and for our children's children. We can't just let them out in the cold and not have a way to get paid.
Senator Schiff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to my colleague, Alex Padilla, for this legislation. Appreciate all of you testifying today. Mr. Simmons, I want to ask you about the song Beth, but you're not here for that, so I'm not going to. And I love that song. I love all your songs. And thank you for bringing my Cusimano constituents with you. What I'd like to ask you, you've been obviously performing for quite a while. When you began your career, there was a kind of understanding that I think was the rationale for this injustice that, well, if radio stations are playing your music, you're getting advertising, more people are buying your albums. Obviously, the industry has completely changed, and the way people access music has completely changed. But if you could talk a little bit about how the industry has evolved and what it means today not to be compensated. That is, I would imagine whatever promotional value you get of your songs played on the radio doesn't somehow create enough recompense to make up for the lack of being paid for those songs being played on the radio.
Well, first and foremost, what you say is so. But I want to cut to the chase, which is when we first began, we were four knuckleheads off the streets of New York who could barely spell, read, or write. We just happened by ourselves. We never knew. No one. Artists are not qualified to understand the business model. We didn't have a business manager. I didn't know that once you get a song that goes on radio, radio is not going to pay you to play the song. But they will have the right, I will say this again, they have the right to use our name and likeness. And you're talking about trademarks. You use my trademark without my permission. Otherwise, I'm going to take your house and your firstborn. Are you kidding me? So radio uses billboards across the country's highways of America to promote the radio stations so that people will tune into their station because they are hearing our voice on their station so they can sell advertising. And more power to you. You should be making more money, become more successful, but the new artists are not going to get their fair shake. There are barely record companies left. The entire music industry is in disarray, and all these pennies are so important, especially for tomorrow's stars who are being born today. This is for our children and for our children's children. We can't just let them out in the cold and not have a way to get paid for their hard work.
Thank you. And Mr. Huppy, I know when your son was very young, he ran for school office with the theme song, Don't Worry, Be Huppy.
Yeah.
Which was brilliant, by the way.
That is correct.
But when that song is played on a streaming service, you're able to identify where the royalties should go, and as the chair was saying, do so very rapidly, very quick order. Let's say that song is played on terrestrial radio. Are there any challenges to being able to determine when that's being played, providing the same kind of mechanism for compensation that you do with the streaming services?
The mechanics behind doing that, Senator, would not be that difficult at all. As you well know, we already receive much of the data about plays and artists and songs when almost all of these FM stations rebroadcast online. So in a way, we're already paying for the digital part of their business. And the FM part of their business is the much larger part, $14 billion a year. And the mechanics of getting the payments out would be quite doable.
Thank you. Mr. Hinton, there are provisions in the bill that are designed to try to help smaller broadcasters. Tell us, if you would, why you believe those provisions are not workable. For, I think, college stations, it might be $100. For smaller stations, it might be $500. Why are those carve-outs not adequate for the smaller stations? And for the larger stations, why shouldn't they pay the compensation of the artists they're airing?
Well, the $500 exemption is going to apply to a small number of stations, but there are over 4,000 FM stations in the country, including some of mine, that would not fall under that exemption. And there are a lot of small market broadcasters right now that are barely hanging on. And understand, it's not $500, it's another $500 on top of FCC regulatory fees and all the PROs that we're already paying. Radio stations are being inundated with PRO fees. Senator Tillerson and I have had this conversation for the last couple of years. The whole landscape, the ecosystem that's worked for 100 years is under strain because streaming services are a problem for the performers. They're a problem for radio stations. We are competing with streaming services that are owned by the largest big tech companies in the world. And our revenues as a result of that are dropping. BIA, who is the organization that tracks revenues for the broadcast industry, this is a very important fact. You may not be aware. Since 2019, radio's gross receipt revenue has decreased 20%, projected to be down another 5% this year, 3.5% next year. So small market radio stations can't take any more fees. It's not 500, it's another 500 on top of everything else that we're paying. And I'll tell you, anybody that thinks $500 is a small chunk of change has never had to run a small market radio station.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hinton, you'd ask if
The moment that lingers from this hearing is not a statistic or a procedural exchange, but a blunt line delivered with disbelief and lived experience. When Gene Simmons leaned forward and said, "They have the right to use our name and likeness," are you kidding me? The room shifted. That was not theater. That was a man who has spent decades inside an industry finally saying out loud what too many creators have learned only after it was too late. In that instant, this hearing stopped being about a technical adjustment to royalty law and became something much bigger. It became a question about fairness in a system that has quietly normalized imbalance. Simmons was not speaking as a rock star. He was speaking as someone who admitted, without ego, that artists often enter their careers unprepared for the machinery waiting behind the curtain. He described a time when musicians were young, inexperienced, and focused entirely on creation, not contracts. And in that gap between art and business, a long-standing injustice took root. What this exchange reveals is a truth that reaches far beyond the music industry. It exposes how outdated rules can persist long after the world that created them has vanished. Radio once argued that airplay was promotion, that exposure itself was payment enough. But Senator Adam Schiff cut directly through that logic, acknowledging what everyone in the room already knew: the industry has changed completely. Albums are no longer the primary source of income. The promotional value of radio no longer compensates for the revenue it generates, and yet the rules remain frozen in time. Simmons made something else painfully clear. Terrestrial radio does not merely play music in a vacuum. It uses artists' voices, names, and reputations to build audiences, to sell advertising, and to sustain a business worth billions of dollars a year. $14 billion, as the testimony confirmed. This is not a struggling cottage industry living hand to mouth. This is a powerful sector that has benefited from creative labor without sharing fairly in the value it extracts. When Simmons compared unauthorized use of a trademark to taking something fundamental from its owner, he wasn't exaggerating. He was naming a principle that underpins American law everywhere else, except here. And then came the quiet but devastating confirmation from Mr. Huppy. The technology already exists. The data already flows. Streaming services track plays instantly and distribute royalties with precision. Even radio stations themselves rebroadcast digitally, proving that identification and reporting are not obstacles, but choices. In other words, the barrier is not technical, it is political. It is about who has power and who has been asked to wait patiently for fairness that never quite arrives. Yet, the hearing did not present villains without context. Small broadcasters spoke about shrinking margins, declining revenue, and an ecosystem under pressure. A 20% drop since 2019 is not trivial. The competition from massive technology platforms has squeezed traditional radio, leaving many local stations struggling to survive. That reality matters. But it does not erase the central question raised in this room. When an industry is under strain, who is expected to absorb the cost? And why does that answer so often point back to the creator? This is where morality enters the frame. For generations, American culture has celebrated innovation, talent, and hard work. Music is not incidental to that story, it is woven into it. Songs become memory markers. They soundtrack movements, moments, and lives. And yet the people who make them have been told repeatedly that gratitude should substitute for compensation, that exposure should replace equity, that the system works because it always has, even as every economic signal says otherwise. Senator Schiff's line of questioning wasn't just legislative, it was philosophical. If we can pay accurately and efficiently in the digital realm, what justification remains for refusing to do so elsewhere? If large broadcasters continue to profit, why should the burden fall disproportionately on those whose work gives the product its value? And perhaps most importantly, what message does this send to the next wave of creators watching this unfold? Because this hearing was not really about Gene Simmons. He will be fine. It was about the future, about whether creative work is treated as something expendable or as labor worthy of respect, whether the American system adapts to reality or clings to traditions that benefit the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable, whether lawmakers are willing to confront entrenched interests or content themselves with small exemptions that leave the core imbalance untouched. In the final moments, as the gavel moved on and voices yielded back their time, the deeper issue remained unresolved but unmistakable. A system built for another era is colliding with the present, and moments like this hearing are where that collision becomes visible, not in slogans, but in testimony, data, and a single incredulous question that cuts through decades of complacency. Fairness does not happen by accident. It happens when uncomfortable truths are spoken in rooms like this and when the public refuses to look away. If you believe creative labor deserves dignity, if you believe rules should evolve with reality, and if you believe transparency matters more than convenience, then this conversation is not over. Support our work to expose the truth. Subscribe to Liberty Report USA.